Behold, my glorious supporter OPG asks, how does one design or redesign a Warframe so that it will remain relevant throughout perpetual updates and additions? I think I'm going to try to answer this question relative to all games and not just Warframe, because I think that it is similar how you accomplish this, really regardless of the game. So the first thing we're going to start with is that Warframe is actually pretty good at this on the whole. Warframes are pretty good at this. Weapons are, on the average game's plane of existence, still pretty good. Not perfect, but Warframes are quite good. Why is Warframe design in Warframe good? It's good because, first of all, they can avoid being overly specific pretty easily. There's a lot of different things to do in Warframe, so you can have fairly objectively specific abilities that are not that specific in the context of Warframe, because Warframe is a game that asks you for quite a few different things throughout gameplay. For example, if you go into a corrupted enemy mission, you're going to encounter nullifiers, which are single targets that you want high fire rate against, probably a single target weapon. You'll get swarms of enemies that you want to kill with an area of effect weapon. You'll get heavier enemies that you can kill with a single hit. If it does enough damage, you don't need a high fire rate weapon, but you could still use that one. You might want to heal. A lot of the time your healing and your loadout comes from your melee weapon, so you're going to want to melee a bit. You'll probably want a directional slam. That'll happen every so often just for traversal. In fact, aside, that's not even your powers yet. It's a lot of stuff. And we're not even talking about objectives. You have objectives you defend, you have objectives you need to keep enemies away from, and you have objectives you just need to make sure don't get hurt. You have objectives that move, you have objectives that don't move. You have things you need to move from objective to objective. And all of those things I just said, if you think about every type of mission we have in this game that is a regular staple mission type that is rewarding, all of the things I just said are in multiple different types of mission. So that's a lot of specific things that you could be good at that would be relevant to many different parts of the game, So because Warframe has that, it's able to avoid having frames be too specific without making their abilities too general, because the game contains enough distinct things that there's sufficient design space. So number one thing, Warframe has a good amount of design space that allows you to create abilities that are specific without making them overly niche. There are exceptions, of course. We have things like Atlas's walls. Atlas's walls are not very good. I don't even know the name of this ability because it's not very useful most of the time, but they are good some of the time. They have a niche where you can sometimes use them to block off parts of tiles, like when you're doing the index and stuff, and sometimes in defense missions. You can do interesting things with them, and in those situations, they're very good. In fact, there are very few alternatives, and they are relatively game-breaking. Not to say that it's that overpowered, but just to say in the grand scheme of things, that's a pretty big impact. And yet elsewhere, they're totally useless. What's going on there? Well, there are principles in the game that you can rely on, that this is a horde shooter, it's a looter shooter, we're space ninjas. We kind of know what is going to be useful. We know that we're not going to want standing cover. If we were playing, let's say, The Division 2, you would have a situation where, that game revolves around cover. The ability to make cover would be a godlike ability in that type of game. But in Warframe, you can jump halfway across a room with one bound. It's a power fantasy game where you can become so tanky you can just stand in front of gunfire, and you can kill all of your enemies in 1 or 2 hits most of the time. So there is absolutely no situation where you'd want cover. To make things even worse, there are a lot of melee enemies in Warframe for a shooter, so oftentimes enemies will simply run around the barrier because it's not radial. And if you think about it, most good defensive abilities in Warframe are circles. We have Frost's Snow Globe and Gara's Glass Wall are two of the premier defensive abilities in the game, and that's because they defect something from pretty much all sides. Gara's Wall doesn't cover the top, but the very top is usually unnecessary. There are flying enemies, but they don't dive into things, so you're fine. But that's because that's predictable given how the game works. You don't have to put that frame in the game to know that Atlas's Wall is not going to be that good, and Gara's Glass is going to be pretty good for defending objectives. Having played the game prior without those abilities, that the core nature of the game will not make that good. And I think what I'm getting at is that it's relatively predictable going forward that Warframe will not just stop being a horde shooter. Like, you will be being attacked from multiple directions on the regular, pretty much no matter what content they put in. So if a frame isn't good against that situation, they're not gonna be good. Like, they're not gonna, it's not like magically there will be some niche that pops up, unless that niche is so small that they're only good for that thing to such a degree that nothing else is good. So in summary, the problem with making things that aren't thinking about the game as a whole and making a game that doesn't have a lot of design space is that if you make an ability that is too specific, it not only won't be useful right away, it's also waiting to trivialize some other niche where it will have no competition because it's so specific, and it won't be useful anywhere else, so people mostly won't have it. And then the very few people that have that will notice, and that will dominate that niche. So your gameplay is kind of like waiting to become trivialized by an ambushing ability that was too narrow previously and then suddenly finds a niche. That sounds good, but it results in something bad. So that is a critical thing to stay away from that I would say Warframe stays away from pretty well. Warframe, if you think about it, is a game with a lot of small and big niches. And if a niche is really small, it's more okay for it to be dominated by a few people. There are not very many frames that can create more loot, but there are a few, and you don't really care about making enemies drop more loot that often. Like, a lot of the time what you're farming is a mission reward, so it makes no never mind, and you just want to do the mission quickly. A lot of the times it's a reward for completing a set of missions. Again, you just want to do them quickly or efficiently or effectively. Sometimes it's a reward for surviving, so you want to be tanky. I'm thinking like arbitrations. And then in some other situations, you want to make more loot. And in those situations, which are relatively infrequent, there is a relatively small selection of the frames in the game that are good for that, which is okay because that niche is relatively small, as long as there is some choice, which there is. The other end of the spectrum, a different problem. So my first problem is that thing about making enough design space, really more about the game than designing the frames. And I think that Warframe has done a good job that way. The second thing, which is something I think Warframe has done a less good job with, and is something that I am of the impression most people don't think is a problem, but I do think it's a problem, is what I would call wasting design space. So the idea here is that the frame has so many things in their kit that sure, they're useful, sure, they're good at stuff, but you're making it harder to design unique, good things in the future because you're taking riffs on an ability that are redundant in the context of that Warframe and still putting them on that same frame. A really good example of this is Titania, but I'm actually going to start by giving you an example of a magic card. So I was talking about how Atlas's Walls would be really good in the Division 2 because that's a cover-based tactical shooter. That is, none of those things are what Warframe is, except for kind of shooter, but most of the better weapons are not exactly precision machines. So, likewise, Titania is kind of a keyword mess, just like a magic card that came out recently called Questing Beast. I will put a picture of this card in the description so you can look at it if you want to. This card has been affectionately nicknamed Texting Beast by some of the community, which is a nickname I love, because this card has, in my opinion, an atrocious design. They literally just took all the keywords and put them on the card. This card, I cannot think of any other card that is just like a good stuff creature, a card that is just a creature that is good stuff, that has 4 different like clauses worth of rules text. Like, what does this do? Like, even right now, I've been staring at this card a lot. I've been memeing about this card a lot. I've done a couple takes of this so far, and I still don't really remember what it does. Like, I believe it is haste, vigilance. Does it have haste? Does it have trample? It can't be blocked by small creatures of some variety. Like, that's the best I can do. But there are definitely more abilities. So the problem with this card is it's kind of a flavor fail. There's way too much going on. Like, maybe there's a flavorful interpretation of this card where the abilities fit like what the card is. It's like a Cerberus creature. It looks cool. It's exciting to look at too because it's got lots of powerful abilities, but it just feels weird, you know what I mean? And it has this inelegance. That's the problem. It has this inelegance where it doesn't feel like the card is in service of one thing. It feels like the card is just waiting for one of its clauses to be overpowered in some context, and then it will suddenly become amazing for kind of like no particular reason. And a lot of the things are kind of redundant too. I don't care as much about trample if the card is able to bypass chump blockers altogether. I don't know if the card has trample, but that's an example of I actually need to see this card now. It's going to bother me. But while I do that, the point I'm trying to make is that putting a bunch of different abilities on a card, I hope you can see how this is very similar to, it does not have trample. Okay, it has vigilance, death touch, and haste. All right, combat damage can't be prevent. Okay, what? The deals damage to an opponent. Oh, and then it can kill a planeswalker. Yeah, so like all these abilities are so obscure. And this type of card, like in the context of Magic the Gathering, wow, this card is expensive too. In the context of Magic the Gathering, this card was put in the game very clearly. I don't know this like from the people who make the game, but it's very clear to me as a longtime player of this game that they made this card to counter a strategy that will become prevalent in the version of the game that is coming. So they test the game a few years ahead. So this card is the product of a strategy being too strong, and then this card is going to save us from that strategy being too strong when the time is right. And until then, it will just be like a nonsensical pile of keywords. Looking at it at a glance, like there's probably going to be some kind of overwhelming planeswalker strategy that will be vulnerable to things that have evasion from small creatures. I don't know. Anyway, enough about Magic, but that's my example. Titania has this problem. Titania has her Dust and her Lantern ability, her 1 and her 3, that are both essentially the exact same thing in the context of her kit. There are situations where one is better than the other, but they are almost exactly the same in the context of a frame that has like another one. What is that noise? Okay. Can you hear that? Anyway, and I think that's bad. I think that it's bad in kind of a subtle way. It doesn't seem like it's a big deal because it's not like the abilities are bad. But you, for one thing, at the surface level, you don't use one of them. And again, it's just because they're so specific, like Lantern and her Pixie Dust thing are so specific, they're just kind of waiting for there to be some niche where suddenly, surprisingly, they are by far the best thing because they're such specific abilities. Now, just giving one of those abilities wholesale to another Warframe doesn't really solve that problem, but it is kind of better than this case where, again, you have a frame that is multiple versions of that problem in one place, and yet they don't provide gameplay. Like, you're not getting gameplay out of it. If you're going to make a unique ability that might trivialize a niche later on, like, at least spread them out, like, make it worth it. Whereas Lantern is cool, the Pixie Dust thing is cool, but using both of them at the same time does not usually make sense. And, like, I like those abilities. I would like to rely on those abilities, but I just can't, like, it's just weird from a gameplay perspective to need, why do I have to do both of these things? You know what I mean? Like, I don't. In practice, I just don't do both of those things, which is too bad, right? So those are the two things I would name. This is 4 things. First of all, that you need to make sure the game has design space, has a breadth of different things that can be valuable, and you need to make sure that frames are designed in a way where their abilities are specific to the degree that the thing that they are doing needs to be specific. If a frame is doing something relatively specific, like increasing loot from enemies, that can be a more specific ability and less frames can have it, because that niche will feel healthy even if it is relatively smaller than like frames that can survive arbitrations should be like almost all of them, because that's something at the end of the game, and indeed it is almost all of them. I would argue it's all of them, and that's good, right? So that succeeds because of that. Warframe is good at that, but it's important that it continue being good at that. And a bad example of this would be Atlas's Wall, where, again, that making a piece of cover, linear cover, is not going to be helpful in the game that Warframe is. Like, having played Warframe prior, before you make Atlas, you already know that ability is not going to be good. And the only time it will become good is if, miraculously, a situation emerges where you need to block off a specific area with a linear wall and you want multiple of them, so you use the augment to get whatever. And then when that situation arises, Atlas will go from being that ability is useless to being that ability is always useless except here where it's the only thing that's any good. And that's bad. So to prevent that from being a ticking time bomb in your game, make the abilities specific, appropriate, and relative to the rest of the game and what niche they're going to fit into. Other thing is kind of the opposite, where you don't want to waste design space. Concentrating those things that could become a niche dominating ability in one frame is obviously bad, because you don't get cool gameplay out of them, but you do get the possibility that they'll trivialize some niche somewhere, and it also just makes the frame feel messy. It makes you feel like you have this cool ability that it's not like you can't use it, but you are being, again, not encouraged, but, like implicitly the game is saying, you won't use this ability. You know what I mean? Like, without that being the intention, of course. The designers design the ability to be used and enjoyed, but that's not what will happen, which is not good. So yes, those two problems, with my examples of the Division 2's cover-based shooter technical gameplay and Texting Beast, I think are two ways that you can avoid designing things badly. Now, by the way, since we did call out the Division 2 and Magic the Gathering just quickly, I do think that those games do a fine job of that. The Division 2 has a little bit of a problem with the first thing, where there isn't enough different things you need to be able to do in the game for there to be enough diversity. Like, there's a lot of things that could be things you needed to do, but not enough of them are things that you need to be able to do. A good example of this is that early in the game, when you're playing Division 2 early on, things that are turrets are overwhelmingly the most useful thing, like by a hilarious margin. Like, it's not, it is not even close. Like, it feels like you are purposefully limiting yourself if you use anything that isn't a turret or heals you. And the connecting factor there is if they make you tankier, basically. You can be a god and just sit behind cover forever and 420 no-scope people, but in reality, the game is most effectively played if you use those abilities early on. By a gigantic margin. It's not that hard yet, so using abilities that make you clear missions faster is just what you are going to choose. On the other hand, Magic, I think, does an incredible job of creating a lot of design space in a really subtle way. The game does a very good job of, I was thinking about this in the shower this morning, striking a balance between Magic is not actually that convoluted to learn at a basic level, and a lot of the rules almost all of the rules that are very complicated are systemic. Like, they could be almost inferred a lot of the time from understanding the system. So, for example, if you hear some combo that uses like some rules jargon, it usually kind of makes sense. Like, it's not that surprising that you can do that if you understand the game as a system. Whereas there are a lot of other games, like Yu-Gi-Oh! Was the one I was thinking of, where they just invent new rules for totally new game systems all the time, like almost every set, which is absurd. Like, that is not good game design. Like, they're just making up more rules to make the game as convoluted and ridiculous as possible, and to make it feel like when you are a new player and you play against a not new player, you are going to feel like they are just making up rules and cheating. Whereas in Magic, you do sometimes feel like that, just like with every advanced game. But it only happens if your opponent is playing a combo deck. Then yes, you might kind of feel like, oh, come on, you can really do that? You know what I mean? Like, you could be making that up. I'm a new player. Who knows? But on the whole, the game does a very good job of not being like that, but having a situation where there's a huge number of different things you could do. So it's even less excusable. It's even less excusable that in a game like that, they would make a card that is just all the keywords, like all the text. Like, just put 4 abilities on this card, like, and they don't feel connected at all. You know what I mean? Like, it's just like solution for meta difficulties, the card. And that is not good. Again, even in a game like Magic, Magic does a good job with this. Magic rarely does this. But in my book, that makes it all the less excusable that they're just dumping keywords on this one card. And like, I feel like in Throne of Eldraine, which is the set that card is from that just came out, I'm thinking, and I feel like there are no other cards like that in the set. So like, you really couldn't have dealt with this one too. Like, you couldn't have solved this meta problem without making this convoluted card. Like, why? And again, not to get too much into Magic in this question that's clearly about Warframe. I do think it's universal, but there are plenty of good 4-drops in green in this set. We do not need this card. Like, it's totally unnecessary. Yeah. I'll link a card that I think is more elegant. It's called Wicked Wolf. This is the card that I run instead of Questing Beast because I don't like Questing Beast. And it's better sometimes. It's not better most of the time, but it's better sometimes. So go check that out. Questing Beast can sod off. We have a time for the Wicked Wolf, of course. Thank you very much for listening. I hope that this was a complete answer to a very interesting question. And OPG, thank you for your support.